Welcome back to part 5 of the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, written in 1789, and he was a West African. He's back in Africa now. I did not long remain after my sister was sold. I was again sold and carried through a number of places till after travelling a considerable time, I came to a town called Tinma, in the most beautiful country I've yet seen in Africa. It was extremely rich, and there were many rivulets which flowed through it and supplied a large pond in the center of the town, where the people washed. Here I first saw and tasted coconuts, which I thought superior to any nuts I had ever tasted before, and the trees were loaded. They were all interspersed among the houses, which had commodious shades adjoining them, and were in the same manner as ours, the insides being neatly plastered and whitewashed. Here I also saw and tasted for the first time sugar cane. Their money consisted of little white shells the size of the fingernail. I was sold here for 172 of them by a merchant who lived and brought me there. I had been about 2 or 3 days at his house when a wealthy widow, a neighbor of his, came there one evening and brought with her an only son, a young gentleman about my own age and size. Here they saw me, and having taken a fancy to me, I was bought of the merchant and went home with them. Her house and premises were situated close to those rivulets I have mentioned, and were the finest I ever saw in Africa. They were extensive, and she had a number of enslaved people to attend her. The next day I washed and perfumed, and when mealtime came, I was led into the presence of my mistress and ate and drank before her with her son. This filled me with astonishment. I could scarce help expressing my surprise that the young gentleman should suffer me, who was bound, to eat with him who was free. And not only so, but that he would not at any time either eat or drink till I had taken first, because I was the eldest, which was agreeable to our customs. Indeed, everything here and all their treatment of me made me forget that I was enslaved. The language of these people resembled ours so nearly that we understood each other perfectly. They had also the very same customs as we. They were likewise enslaved people who daily attended to us, while my young master and I, with other boys, sported with our darts and bows and arrows, as I had been used to do at home. In this resemblance to my former happy state, I passed about 2 months, and now began to think I was to be adopted into the family, and was beginning to be reconciled to my situation, and to forget by degrees my misfortunes, when all at once the delusion vanished. For without the least previous knowledge, one morning early, while my dear master and companion was still asleep, I was awakened out of my reverie to fresh sorrow, and hurried away even amongst the uncircumcised. Thus, at the very moment I dreamed of the greatest happiness, I found myself most miserable, and it seemed as if fortune wished to give me this taste of joy, only to render the reverse more poignant. The change I now experienced was as painful as it was sudden and unexpected. It was a change indeed, from a state of bliss to a scene which is inexpressible by me, as it was discovered an element I never before beheld, and till then had no idea of, and wherein such instances of hardship and cruelty continually occurred as I can never reflect on with horror. So that long thing he's saying, it's that he had this high point and he thought things were about to change, and then he goes down into the valley of despair and terror and horror. Continuing, all the nations and peoples I hitherto passed through resembled our own in their manners, customs, and language, but I came at length to a country the inhabitants of which differed from us in all those particulars. I was very much struck with this difference, especially when I came among a people who did not circumcise and ate without washing their hands. They cooked also in iron pots and had European cutlasses and crossbows, which were unknown to us, and fought with their fists among themselves. Their women were not so modest as ours, for they ate, drank, and slept with their men. But above all, I was amazed to see no sacrifices or offerings among them. In some of those places, the people ornamented themselves with scars and likewise filed their teeth very sharp. They wanted sometimes to ornament me in the same manner, but I would not suffer them, hoping that I might sometime be among a people who did not thus disfigure themselves as I thought they did. At last I came to the banks of a large river which was covered with canoes, in which the people appeared to live with their household utensils and provisions of all kinds. I was beyond measure astonished at this, as I had never before seen any water larger than a pond or a rivulet, and my surprise was mingled with no small fear when I was put into one of these canoes, and we began to paddle and move along the river. We continued to go on thus till night, and when we came to land and made fires on the bank, each family by themselves, some dragged their canoes on shores, others stayed and cooked in theirs, and laid in them all night. Those on the land had mats, of which they made tents, some in the shape of their little houses. In these we slept, and after the morning meal we embarked again and proceeded as before. I was often very astonished to see some of the women as well as the men jump into the water, dive to the bottom, come up again and swim about. Thus I continued to travel, sometimes by land, sometimes by water, through different countries and various nations, till at the end of 6 or 7 months after I had been kidnapped, I arrived at the seacoast. It would be tedious and uninteresting to relate all the incidences which befell me during this journey, and which I have not yet forgotten, of the various hands I passed through, and the manners and customs of all the different people among whom I lived. I shall therefore only observe that in all the places where I was, the soil was exceedingly rich. The pumpkins, edas, plantains, yams, etc., were in great abundance and of their incredible size. There are also vast quantities of different gums, though not used for any purpose, and everywhere a great deal of tobacco. The cotton grew quite wild, and there was plenty of redwood. I saw no mechanics whatever in all the way, except such as I mentioned. The chief employment in all these countries was agriculture, and both male and females, as with us, were brought up to it and trained in the arts of war. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions, too, differing so much from ours, their long hair and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm in me this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment, that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them, all to exchange my condition with the meanest slave in my own country, the enslaved person in the worst condition in his country. When I look around the ship too and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, with a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people about me, who I believe were some of those who brought me on board, and had been receiving their pay. They talked to me in order to cheer me, but all in vain. I asked them if we were not to be eaten, excuse me, eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. They told me I was not, and one of the crew brought me a small portion of spirituous liquor in a wine glass, but being afraid of him, I would not take it out of his hands. One of the black people therefore took it from him and gave it to me, and I took a little down my palate, which instead of reviving me, as they thought it would, threw me into the greatest consternation at the strange feeling it produced, having never tasted any such liquor before. Soon after this, the black people who brought me on board went off and left me abandoned to despair. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore, which I now considered as friendly, and I even wished for my former slavery in preference to my present situation, which was filled with horrors of every kind, still heightened by my ignorance of what was to be undergone. I was not long suffered to indulge my grief. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for my last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon to my grief, two of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element the first time I saw it. Yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I've seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. This indeed was often the case with myself. In a little time after, amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation, which in a small degree gave ease to my mind. I inquired of these what was to be done with us. They gave me to understand we were to be carried to these white people's country to work for them. I then was a little revived and thought, if it were no worse than working, my situation was not so desperate. But still I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in such a savage manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty. And this not only shone through us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. One white man in particular I saw when we were permitted to be on deck, flogged so unmercifully with a large rope near the foremast that he died in consequence of it, and they tossed him over the side as they would have done a brute. This made me fear these people the more, and I expected nothing less than to be treated in the same manner. I could not help expressing my fears and apprehensions to my countrymen. I asked them if these people had no country, but lived in this hollow place, the ship. They told me they did not, but came from a distant one. Then said I, how comes it in all our country we never heard of them? They told me because they lived so far off. I then asked where were their women, and had they any like themselves? I was told they had, and why, said I, do we not see them? And they answered, because they were left behind. I asked how the vessel could go. They told me they could not tell, but there were cloths upon the masts of the help of the ropes I saw, and then the vessel went on. And the white men had some spell or magic they put into the water when they liked in order to stop the vessel. I was exceedingly amazed at this account and really thought there were spirits. I therefore wish much to be from amongst them, for I expected that they would sacrifice me. But my wishes were in vain, for we were so quartered that it was impossible for any of us to make our escape. While we stayed on the coast, I was mostly on deck. And one day, to my great astonishment, I saw one of these vessels coming in with the sails up. As soon as the whites saw it, they gave a great shout, at which we were amazed, and the more so as the vessel appeared larger by approaching nearer. At last she came to an anchor in my sight, and when the anchor was let go, I and my countrymen who saw it were lost in astonishment to observe the vessel stop, and were not convinced it was done by magic. Soon after this, the other ship got her boats out, and they came on board of us, and the people of both ships seemed very glad to see each other. Several of the strangers also shook hands with us black people, and made motions with their hands, signifying, I suppose, that we were to go to their country. But we did not understand. At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put on the deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated. This produced copious perspiration, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the enslaved, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, the waste tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Happily, perhaps for myself, I was soon reduced so low here that it was thought necessary to keep me almost always on deck, and from my extreme youth I was not put in fetters. In this situation, I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were almost daily brought up on deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries. Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and as often wished I could change my condition for theirs, so as wishing to be drawn in the bottom of the sea. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful, and heightened my apprehension and my opinion of the cruelty of the whites. One day they had taken a number of fishes, and when they had killed and satisfied themselves with as many as they thought fit, to our astonishment, who were on the deck, rather than give any of them to us to eat as we expected, they tossed the remaining fish into the sea. Although we begged and prayed for some as well as we could, but in vain, and some of my countrymen, being pressed by hunger, took an opportunity when they thought no one saw them of trying to get a little privately, but they were discovered, and the attempt procured them some very severe floggings. One day, when we had a smooth sea and moderate wind, two of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, I was near them at the time, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow, who on account of his illness was suffered to be out of irons, also followed their examples, and I believe many more would very soon have done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. Those of us that were the most active were in a moment put down under the deck, and there was such a noise and confusion amongst the people of the ship as I never heard before, to stop her and get the boat to go after this enslaved. However, two of the wretches were drowned, but they got the other, and afterwards flogged him unmercifully for thus attempting to prefer death to slavery. So I'm going to stop here. I really appreciate Olaudah Equiano for writing this down, because I've always wondered, yes, we've seen things, but I wondered what horrors the ancestors suffered in these slave ships, and to have it in his own words, it's just amazing and sad and everything. So take a deep breath, and thank you for listening.